At the time I'm making this video, that being early March 2021, the PC graphics card market is all messed up. As soon as stock comes available, GPUs are instantly selling out, which means the only graphics cards you can really find for sale anywhere are being sold by people looking to turn a profit by selling them for 2, 3, or 4 times their MSRP. So yeah, I know right now is a pretty bad time to be making a video like this. The thing is, I've had this hardware for 3 months now, waiting for things to change, and so far, that hasn't happened. I thought about putting this video off even longer, but I have no idea how much longer the current GPU situation is going to continue. But I do know that what goes up must come down. Meaning the cryptocurrency bubble that is currently causing all this will eventually burst, and prices and availability will come back to normal. At which point, if you're wanting to buy a 5600 XT, you'll know what to expect from it because you've watched this video. Back at the end of November, I was lucky enough to get my hands on this Gigabyte RX 5600 XT. Which was right before they became impossible to buy at normal prices. As you know from the title of the video, I paired it with an i5-10600K. I also threw 16 gigabytes of G.Skill Trident Z3600MHz CL18 DDR4 into this system. So now that you know all the core hardware we're working with, let's see what this combo is capable of. Our first game in the lineup is Call of Duty Warzone. At 1080p, I put all the graphical settings at their highest, except for shadow map resolution, which I left on high. Ray tracing is of course turned off for all of these tests because this is a RX 5600 XT, which doesn't support hardware ray tracing. Running around outside, the frame rate is really good, hanging out in the 130s to the 140s. When moving inside of buildings, the frame rate moves up into the 150s and 160s, since there's only the stuff immediately around you the GPU needs to draw. I did notice some minor CPU bottlenecking when inside of buildings and stuff. The GPU usage percentage would drop to the 80s and low 90s. But once I was back outside, GPU usage would move right back up to the high 90s, right where we want it. So I feel for 1080p gaming, the i5-10600K and the 5600 XT are a really nice pair. Turning the resolution up to 1440p took our outdoor frame rate to the high 80s to low 100s, but mostly hovered around 90 FPS. I did see occasional dips down into the 70s, but the frame rate never dropped below 60. When inside of buildings, the frame rate came up a good 20 or so FPS, typically sitting around 110 to 115 frames per second. This is using the same graphical settings I used at 1080p, mind you. So everything is maxed out except for shadow map resolution, which is on high. The next game I took a look at is Borderlands 3. At 1080p on bad settings, I got between 70 and 80 FPS, and that was in both indoor and outdoor areas. If you're big into this game, you're going to be able to tell right away that I haven't played this one much and don't really know what I'm doing. But this video is about how the hardware performs, not my skill level, or more appropriately, my lack of skill. Even when getting into pretty intense battles, the frame rate stayed in the same 70 to 80 FPS range. The highest frame rate I saw while playing at 1080p was actually when I was driving around in a vehicle, which kind of surprised me, getting up over 80 FPS and even into the low 90s. Keeping the settings on bad, but moving the resolution up to 1440p, the 5600 XT wasn't quite able to get us to 60 FPS. The frame rate was in the 40s and 50s, which is lower than most people will want to play this game at. But on the bright side, I did see pretty consistent frame times, which meant even though the frame rate was below 60 FPS, the game wasn't choppy, and there wasn't any stuttering, so gameplay still felt smooth. The third game in the lineup is Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This is another game I haven't played all that much, but I have found that this village area is one of the most GPU intensive areas of the game that I've played this far, which is why I do my frame rate testing here. When Lara's in tombs and stuff, the path is more restricted, which means there's a lot less stuff the GPU has to render, resulting in a higher frame rate in those areas. Anyway, at 1080p, I set anti-aliasing to SMAA-T2X and all the other graphics settings to their highest level, and the lowest frame rate I saw running around the village was in the 60s. Most of the time, though, it was in the mid to high 70s. At 1440p, with all the graphics settings, once again, set as high as they'll go, well, all but anti-aliasing, that is, the lowest frame rate I saw was in the 40s. But for the most part, hovered in the low to mid 50s. When I moved out of the village and into some of the areas with a more restricted path to follow, the frame rate increased to just over 60 FPS. In my opinion, Tomb Raider being an adventure game, and for the most part being fairly slow-paced, you don't need a super high frame rate to enjoy it. Honestly, I feel a game like this can go as low as 30 FPS and still be a good experience. But as always, turning the settings down can help increase the frame rate if you feel the need. Now for yet another game I haven't played all that much, Doom Eternal. I've enjoyed playing Doom games since the first one came out in 1993. And even though I haven't spent much time playing this latest installment of the franchise, like all the Doom games before it, it's great fun to play. Wow, 1993, really? It's kind of crazy to think this franchise is almost 30 years old. Anyway, unless your graphics card has at least 8 gigabytes of VRAM, you can't turn the texture pool size up higher than Ultra. So, since the 5600 XT only has 6 gigabytes, I had to leave that setting on Ultra, but was able to turn all the other settings up to Ultra Nightmare. At 1080p, the i5-10600K and RX 5600 XT crushed this game. The lowest frame rate I noticed was around 130 FPS, but most of the time, the frame rate was well above that, pulling 170 to 180 FPS. There were even times it went over 200 FPS. So yeah, I think this combo plays this game just fine at 1080p. Playing in this same demon-infested area at 1440p, using the same graphical settings, obviously resulted in a lower frame rate than what we saw at 1080p, but I still never saw the frame rate drop below 100 FPS. The highest frame rate I saw was 160 some odd FPS, but most of the time Doom ran between 120 to 130 FPS at 1440p, so another stellar performance from the i5-10600K and 5600 XT in my opinion. Up next we have Fortnite. This is a game I actually have spent some time playing. Not that you'll be able to tell by my poor gameplay, but at 1080p on epic settings, I jumped into a game of Team Rumble to see what our performance would be like. The thing I like about Team Rumble is, first of all, it allows me to actually get some eliminations, but I also feel it's a good game mode to test out a PC's performance in Fortnite, because you have up to 40 players, all packed into a small space, building structures and trying to eliminate each other. No other game mode in Fortnite has this much stuff going on all at the same time, so I feel it's a really good worst-case scenario. If a system performs well in Team Rumble, then it will perform great in other game modes as well. As you can see, in these circumstances, I was getting over 100 FPS almost constantly at 1080p max settings. The frame rate did dip down into the 90s at times, but most of the time it was in the 110 to 115 FPS range. At 1440p, using the same epic settings I used at 1080p, the frame rate ranged from the 60s into the 70s, but never fell below 60 FPS. So overall, the i5-10600K and the 5600 XT provided a solid gaming experience in Fortnite at this resolution. FarCry 5 is one of those games that likes a CPU with a high clock speed, and the i5-10600K pairs up really nicely with the 5600 XT in this title. Like I do with most all my game testing, I turned the graphics settings up as high as they would go, and at 1080p I was happy to see our GPU usage pretty much maxed out, which resulted in a frame rate over 100 FPS pretty much all the time. There were occasional dips below 100, but most of the time the game was in the 110 to 120 FPS range on ultra settings at 1080p. Even at 1440p, this system delivered a solid 70 plus FPS on ultra settings when outdoors, and moving inside brought the frame rate up into the 90s. In Ghost Recon Breakpoint, I used the very high quality preset and set the texture quality to high, and this resulted in a frame rate in the 80s. The amount of detail in the trees and foliage in this game is just incredible to me. It's such a pretty looking game. Moving on out of the forest into this facility, the frame rate actually went up into the 90s with peaks over 100 FPS. Turning the resolution up to 1440p at the same graphical settings, we were able to maintain a pretty solid frame rate above 60 FPS. Even when I went all Leroy Jenkins into this facility loaded with bad guys, the frame rate stayed up around 60. It did drop into the 50s here as I was backed into a corner fighting for my life, but always stayed near enough to 60 FPS. It didn't impact the game experience at all. And the last game in the lineup is The Division 2. I set the graphical settings to Ultra and then turned VSync off. I used to play this game quite a bit, but haven't played it now in a while, so it took me a bit to shake off the rust. At 1080p, performance was pretty similar to what I saw in Ghost Recon Breakpoint. When I was outside running through the streets, the frame rate was typically in the 80s and 90s, and when I moved to indoor areas, it would jump up over 100 FPS. At 1440p, The Division 2 looks so good. This game really is visually stunning. Running through the streets again, the frame rate was around 60 FPS. It did fall into the 50s at times, but the frame times were really good, so things still felt pretty smooth. The frame rate was about the same during this part of my test, no matter where I was outside. At one point, I got into a firefight with these guys, and even with a fair number of NPCs coming after me, the frame rate stayed in that same 50 to 60 FPS range. So there you have it. If you're looking for a high refresh rate 1080p max settings experience, I feel the RX 5600 XT paired with an i5-10600K passes the test with flying colors. It's even a solid 1440p high to ultra settings 60 FPS config for those looking to make the step up from 1080p. At the time I'm making this video, you should have no trouble at all picking up an i5-10600K. In fact, you can pick one up at my Amazon store if you'd like. Link in the video description. The 5600 XT, on the other hand, those are much more difficult to come by right now. I picked this one up at the end of November 2020 for $290 US, which I believe is the MSRP for this card. So until you start seeing them for around that price, I wouldn't recommend buying one. So how much longer do you guys think this GPU shortage mess is going to last? Do you think things will begin improving soon? Or do you think it's going to be the third or fourth quarter of the year or even longer before we start seeing GPU pricing and availability normalize? I want to know what you guys think, so please share your thoughts in the comments. Also, before you take off, there's those YouTube things you do that really help the channel. And of course, you can subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one if you are not already subscribed. Thanks for watching. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I look forward to hanging out with you in another video really soon. We'll see you later.